It's been such a robust discussion of that's very solutions oriented, and I very much appreciate that. If I would have permission to share my screen, I'm going to do that and do a shorter version of the presentation I did so that I can pause and take questions if needed. And then I'm really looking forward to the breakout groups. Before I get started, though, I just want to preface my presentation by saying that I have worked with the acequias for many years and have still consider myself a student of the acequias, and anyone who works on water knows that there's no end to the learning, that it's a lifelong process of learning and critical thinking and observation and devotion. And if you're here on a Saturday morning, you must be one of New Mexico's great water nerds. I think that's a term that our Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury uses a lot to describe herself as a water nerd. So we're in good company this morning, and it's great to see such a lively group here. So I'll talk about a little bit what I know about water sharing and equity from an acequia perspective. There are people in the group today who have much more expertise in the Middle Rio Grande than I do. So I'm going to defer to you on specific ways that these concepts are applicable in the Middle Rio Grande, and then I hope that we can really dig in during the breakout groups. In the original presentation, I focused on three big topics. One was acequia water sharing in general, and then how we protect existing water rights in the climate crisis and the era of reallocation. Meaning this era of commodification of water. And third, I talked about equity between groundwater and surface water. And I actually want to spend most time on that because I think that's one of the most relevant issues in the Middle Rio Grande from the conversations I've been part of in relation to the Middle Rio Grande. But the idea of water sharing is a very old principle in New Mexico, and it predates New Mexico. It's the very practical engagement with your neighbors on how to share a scarce resource. And it's something that predates statehood by centuries, if not millennia, because we had indigenous peoples, first peoples here, who have been stewards and caretakers of water for a very long time. The acequias have expanded the extent of irrigation and created pressures on the water since a long time ago. And there's always been a lot of, there's always been scarcity, and there's always been a need to work through the conflicts and tensions over scarcity for centuries. And it's like Sylvia Rodriguez said in her book, Acequia's Water, Sanctity, and Place. She said that water sharing agreements are the pearl that comes out of conflict. So that's you don't have water sharing where there hasn't been conflict, and the water sharing agreement is what comes out of that. And so that's been happening in New Mexico for a very long time. And then we know that around the turn of the 20th century, with the 1907 Water Code, New Mexico adopted the prior appropriation doctrine. So our state does have the legal framework to deal with scarcity, which is prior appropriation, but for the most part, we choose not to. This, as a state and as neighboring communities, there's a strong inclination to try to figure out an alternative to shortage sharing. To prior appropriation, and often that alternative is shortage sharing or water sharing. And with the active water resource management regulations that were adopted by the state engineer in the early part of the 21st century, this concept of alternative administration was codified in regulation. And this idea of alternative administration is probably the wave of the future in terms of how we're going to be managing our water. That doesn't mean that prior appropriation isn't the law of the land. And there's important equity considerations with prior appropriation, because the oldest water rights are the most senior, starting with the pueblos, and then the acequias and other agricultural water rights. And so when there are agreements made, that prior appropriation doctrine is always in the background because the seniors always have that in mind, and the prior appropriation implementation is always sort of the stick, like we need to figure out how to share water or else the other alternative is prior appropriation. That's kind of what I think is a big picture background or context. So there's a strong incentive to do shortage sharing or water sharing, and that is that prior appropriation would cut off potentially important uses in our society. So acequias, when acequias do water sharing, it's typically in some cases I noted that it's autonomous. There's just autonomous customs that don't involve the state engineer or any authority other than the acequias. And in a lot of cases where acequias are doing water sharing, it definitely involves the state engineer, such as in the Rio Chama, or sometimes the water sharing is the result of an adjudication. When I've heard in the past, Mike Hammond described what Rio Grande Conservancy District does. They talk about doing water sharing internally within the district between all the different users. And so it's compared to other parts of the state where I've seen water sharing agreements, the concept of water sharing is more explicit when there's multiple parties involved, and there's an understanding of how much different parties are getting, whether it's a rotation or it's adjusting the head gates. So that's the way I understand water sharing. The thing I wanted to say about the issue of equity, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, because I think there are two issues when we're talking about our impending water crisis that comes from climate change. And one is, do we have the institutions and the resources necessary in order to enable water sharing agreements to be made, is one question I have. And then the other question I have is related to this idea of reallocation of water and water transfers. And as water becomes, as there's pressures mount to move water out of agriculture, there's a lot of equity considerations there. And that's, to me, the commodification of water and the movement of water is sort of the antithesis of water sharing. It's not necessarily mutually exclusive, but it is a way of reallocating water using a market system, and in some cases it's irreversible. And so that's the other big topic. But I'm going to come back to the presentation a little bit, and I'm going to jump around because I don't want to go through the whole thing. It'll take too long. So one solution I mentioned at the last meeting was resources for water sharing. The problem is that very little resources are explicitly allocated for the process of developing water sharing agreements. Even though there is a mention of alternative administration in active water resource management, having the capacity, the staff, the water resource specialists needed to help facilitate these is something that is a gap in our water resources management. Talked here about the need for data, promulgation of district-specific regulations for active water resource management. And the bottom line is that the state engineer's office does not have the staff to go through this process. It's resource intensive. It should be a participatory process in an ideal world, and the agency lacks the resources to do that. So that's one first strategic action that I think we can all discuss and see if we can find some consensus on what kind of resources the state engineer needs in order to make this happen. The other aspect is protecting existing water rights, and really this is an idea that's that we're all starting to take to heart, and that's that climate change is going to have impacts on groundwater. And we can see the impacts on surface water. It's something that's very visual. But if we're going to have any hope of protecting our groundwater for future generations, we're going to need more conjunctive management. But the climate change impacts to groundwater, that there's going to be reduced river flows, reduced recharge, increased pumping, which could lead to aquifer depletion. On top of that, we have a water policy shock doctrine happening in New Mexico, which is, to me, the acceleration of the commodification of water by trying to streamline transfers or water leases in particular through preliminary approval and shortcutting the due process that existing water right holders have in the law to protect themselves from impairment or to protect the public welfare or the conservation of water. So I'm gonna skip ahead through some of these ones. So in terms of protecting water and water rights, we have to ensure that whatever transfers occur, and acknowledging that the needs of our society will change and it's not static, but when there are transfers, they shouldn't be fast-tracked, and the impacts to existing water rights and also natural systems should be very fully analyzed and vetted. Again, state engineer needs more resources to do that. Community organizations and advocates who are the watchdogs for their respective rivers and aquifers need resources too, and that's a more complicated. It's not as simple of a policy solution, but if we are going to have equity, the communities that are affected need resources in order to speak up if they think there's going to be some impact to their water rights. And then thirdly, which I want to end with and hopefully devote more time to, is this equity between groundwater and surface water. And I kind of picture it like there's these two interconnected pools of water, and all the surface water users, by necessity, when there's less water, have to share the shortage, and are by necessity, by just the physical reality, they have to limit themselves and curtail themselves to using less water or for less time. That's the nature of a water sharing agreement. However, there's an equity issue with groundwater users, because the surface water users might be sharing and cutting back in order to fit within the parameters of nature, where groundwater users are not necessarily under the same constraints. Once they have their groundwater permit and there's been a calculation of what the consumptive use from surface was transferred to ground, they're just pumping. They're pumping rain or shine, drought or no drought. They're just going to keep pumping, and there's not shortage sharing happening between surface and ground. Surface users are cutting down what they use, and groundwater users don't necessarily do that. And there's a couple of examples I shared here about, for example, a new cannabis grower might just tap the water utility authority for water and just use groundwater to irrigate a crop, whereas all their fellow growers in the middle Rio Grande are having to be cut back because of shortages. Similarly, Rio Rancho can buy up water rights for their permit, sometimes from the Rio Gemes, and the Gemes users are going to great pains to share water, scarce water, but Rio Rancho is not part of that sharing agreement. Once Rio Rancho buys the water and moves it to the ground, they're autonomous. They're just like pumping, and they're not having to engage in shortage sharing in the same way that surface users are having to do. So in the middle Rio Grande, it's just something to think about between surface and groundwater users. And those of you who are here from the middle Rio Grande could probably speak to that more. But the solutions could be that we have more rigorous conjunctive management that protects groundwater during times of drought. That would mean having a much more robust data collection system with monitoring wells, promulgation of AWRM regulations in the middle Rio Grande and other parts of the state, that perhaps we can scrutinize surface to ground transfers more to ensure that it's not leading to irreversible declines in the aquifer. and development of local and regional water plans that are based on conjunctive management, and also strategies based on very robust data sets. And so just imagine every region having its own water model, and you could evaluate if there was a proposed transfer or there was a reduction in river flows in a particular year. You could see what the implications of that are going to be and plan accordingly, and empower local decision makers to plan accordingly, whether they be, acequias or irrigation districts or cities and towns that are pumping. And those are, that local decision making is going to be very important. Lastly, there's a trend where, and I'm very worried about this trend as an acequia person, because there's more proposals to do surface to groundwater well transfers or supplemental groundwater wells, which are almost the same thing. And when acequias are faced with these kind of applications, because acequias have local governance authority over transfers into or out of the acequias, when the acequias try to regulate these and put conditions on them, they've really run into some obstacles with the state engineer's office respecting those conditions. The only way we're going to really have a handle on these not having long-term effects on our aquifers and our long-term water supplies is to carefully look at the impact of increased pumping of our aquifers, and be able to regulate it, to be able to put some parameters or boundaries around when it can be done and how much. Otherwise, if all of our surface water is then transferred to groundwater, everything will go. And if agriculture goes, the river goes. And then that's the water commons that we should all be we should all care about. And it's not just about agriculture as acequias, but it's the very systems that we all depend on for life. Those are some ideas. I thank you for listening, and I appreciate. I'll look forward to hearing from everyone, and I appreciate your views. Thank you.
Hello, I think we've got a couple of minutes for questions if Paul would be available. And,
absolutely.
I don't see any hands, but my screen doesn't really tell me much. If anybody's got a question, why don't you just unmute yourself and speak?
Paula, this is Paul Holton. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned two elements of the current water code: conservation and public interest. How do you see those playing into this conflict between prior appropriation and equity? And how can that be addressed in the legislature?
Well, I'm sure you have a lot to say about that, Paul, because I feel like you're on the forefront of answering that very question. But I'd be happy to share some thoughts about that. First, I think that the way that water transfers are being handled now is almost it's a nightmare for equity. If there isn't any consideration of equity, you're lucky if there's even a decent analysis of impairment, but consideration of conservation of water and public welfare seem to be almost absent. And I don't know if that's too strong of an assessment, but I would say that having been an observer of a lot of protests, that when protestants make those arguments, they don't seem to be given much weight in the administrative hearing process by the hearing administrator or hearing examiner, and therefore they're not given much weight by the state engineer's office. And for organizations, advocacy organizations, communities who are trying to protect water for their future, for their community, those arguments are very profound. If you really dig in and read them and listen to the testimony, they're talking about their very survival. They're talking about cultural identity. They're talking about sustainability and resiliency and future generations. And they're given short shift in the water transfer hearings. And so I think potentially those criteria could be, if they were implemented, they could lead to more equity in the decision-making process. But the big equity problem with water transfers is that the entities that are, most of the time, the entities that are wanting to transfer water have a lot more resources than the protestants who are protesting. At least that's true in a lot of Acequia communities. I've seen some odd things happen in the Permian Basin where oil and gas companies get into protest wars with each other, and that's a whole other thing. But generally, where there are protests, and the ones that I'm familiar with in the Acequia world, they are low-income communities with very little resources filing a protest against a developer, for example, and the developer always has more money to push through the protest, the administrative hearing process, and then a court battle. So usually the community groups are represented by nonprofit attorneys that do this work, like the Environmental Law Center. And as you know, there's attorneys that will take on important public interest cases. But it's a big burden for communities to have to bear. And so I think that's a big equity question. I think the way that the laws actually put it into action by the state engineer, there's some equity problems. And even the way that impairment is being evaluated isn't thorough, as your case would illustrate with Aquifer Science and the good decision by the judge on consideration of climate change. So yeah, I think that the law is clear as it is, and I don't know that if there was a commitment by our executive, by our state engineer, to say we will really consider what the law says, I think that'd be a big step forward. And as you know, efforts to improve upon that law to make it give it more teeth and require actual consideration or written findings, meet with a lot of resistance, both by state engineer and by what I've heard state engineer staff refer to as the applicant community. So I think it's a difficult policy question, and I would like to see something like that there have to be written findings, that public welfare and conservation can't just be ignored. Like, there have to be written findings on all three criteria. And if we were going to strengthen the law, I think your idea of adding climate change was a good one. I also think something about future generations. How is this going to impact future generations? And maybe that's part of public welfare, maybe that's part of conservation. It could be, but I think we should all be thinking about what's going to be, my son's only 18. He's going to be here in 50 years. And I want to know if there's going to be water here. It's as simple as that. And so anyway, I appreciate the question, Paul. Thanks.
Okay, now I'm seeing hands. We've got a Sarah. Why don't you unmute yourself and.
Hey, buenos dias, Paula. It's Zaira. Thank you so much for the presentation and for all of the work that you've done on water in the Acequias. I know you've mentioned the state engineer a couple of times about how they don't have the staffing to do the monitoring, to track things. And I see that there's, I think, 2 bills this legislative session related to that. I think one bill is to provide more funding to hire more people in the state engineer's office, which we know that he resigned because he said that there wasn't enough resources and staffing. And then there's another bill about what qualifications the state engineer would have to have. I'm just curious what NMA's thoughts on that are, because y'all are so strong in the legislature. And if there was 17 new positions, like, is there a way for advocates to help shape what the kind of work that needs to be done?
Hi, Saida. Buenos dias. I'm glad you're here. Yeah, I think to say that the state engineer needs more resources without saying for what is incomplete. So we as advocates, we do need to do that work. And actually, and I know Normcom has really put together some really excellent recommendations about not just, yeah, give them a bump in their budget, but this is where the critical resources are needed. And I'm not completely familiar with everything in Normcom's recommendations, which are, were developed for this Middle Rio Grande Water Assembly. But from what I recall, one of them was to improve the hydrology bureau. And one of the things I thought, I haven't looked at those recommendations, but it seems to me that having only one or two hearing examiners for the whole state is part of the reason for the backlog of water applications. And, and it's not just hearing examiners, there's a whole staff apparatus that looks at those things. But there has to be enough staff to thoroughly look at the applications and do a thorough analysis of impairment and public welfare and conservation. So I've always felt like that administrative hearing unit is understaffed as well. I know that in the state engineer, the executive budget request, they were asking for more staff to implement the online posting requirement. And that was something in 2019, we passed a bill that required online notice of water transfers and water leases. And so they want more money for that. So those are a few thoughts off the top of my head, but I think your thinking is spot on, that as advocates, we should definitely be weighing in on not just that they need more money, but where that money should be going strategically. Water planning is another big one. I know from serving on the ISC that the commission, the staff have had a deep commitment to water planning, but have never been given the resources to fully do what they're envisioning. And the request last year for $350,000 to have more staff and some contractors was never made its way into the budget by the legislature. So the Interstate Stream Commission staff made do with partnerships and leveraged money from other agencies to do the 50-year water plan, which I admire how resourceful the team has been, and the partners have been really gracious. But I think funding for water planning is really important, because it's not a one-time thing; it's an ongoing thing that has to be happening. So that's a really good question. So the one bill, House Bill 24, that says give $12 million to the state engineer's office, that'll probably just get rolled into the budget process. That's kind of opaque. I'm not really sure how that'll. I think it's done a lot to elevate the need, but what's going to be really important is what's actually in the LFC budget and the executive budget. And the executive budget increased the state engineer's office budget by 4%, and the LFC, Legislative Finance Committee, was only by 1.9%. And given the fact that we're in a water crisis, and that John D'Antonio's resignation brought so much attention to the need for more resources and staff in the agency, one would have thought there would have been a bigger infusion. The policymakers would have really seen some urgency in bringing some more money to the agency. And to me, a 1.9% increase is really not adequate. It doesn't even get us to where we were when Bill Richardson was governor, and that's there have been dozens of vacancies over the past several years. So that's really important. As far as the qualifications, I think the bill would that's proposed would change it so that it could be a hydrologist or an attorney, and I think something else, maybe an engineer without a license, a professional. Someone else here might know the details, but I think it's a good idea to broaden the pool. I personally am biased in that I think it should be a technical person. I think it should be someone with engineering background or hydrology background, because they already have a lead counsel. You know, there's always lead counsel, and that lead counsel is very influential. In fact, if you've ever worked with a state engineer's office, the general counsel or lead counsel almost always has as much or more power than the state engineer, because state engineer listens to that person. So, you know, I don't know if having an attorney as a state engineer would be necessary to broaden it that much. But definitely, you know, I think someone who has some public policy background and a technical background would be ideal. Because with public policy, then you'd have somebody that could be more sensitive to issues of equity and social justice. Whereas the way it's been in the past, it's just been technical. And maybe that's why public welfare and conservation aren't even, you know, given enough consideration.
Thank
I
you.
think-
That's cool. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate all the work you've done to cultivate relationships with the state engineers over the years so that they could understand the SECIAs and water sharing. So thanks, Paula.
We've got 4 hands up and we're just about starting to steal time from the breakout groups. Paula, would you be willing to answer the questions offline if they put them in the chat?
Absolutely. And I'm sorry, I take too long with my answers, so I apologize if I went over time.
Bob, this is Ralph. I'm gonna usurp that and ask this question. Hi, Paula. Thanks a lot for that. Excellent. I mean, it might have gone long, but it was very informing. So thank you. My question has to do with a couple things that you mentioned in your presentation, and that being that while prior appropriations is the law of New Mexico, alternative administration has been codified in the early 21st century, and you think that's going to be the wave of the future. I think that a lot of our legislators, which are brand new in the last 3 years, I learned in talking to Melanie Stansberry that they never get a primer on water law. They just have to come into this. So we have so many new legislators that may not even know what alternative administration is. We probably have a lot of participants here that don't know what alternative administration is. If we can better communicate it to our legislators, would you be able to address that very briefly? And then, like Bob says, we need to get into our breakout rooms.
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I do have a soft spot for the legislators. I sympathize because they're volunteers and they come from all walks of life, and every area of public policy that they're addressing is very specialized, and water is very specialized. And I didn't, you know, I have a teenage son, and and he asked me one time about like compacts and, you know, things relating to the Interstate Stream Commission. I said, it's like Dungeons and Dragons, you know. There's a certain like scientific reality we're dealing with, but there's also all these rules. There's like kind of arcane rules. They have a reason and a rationale, but it's almost like, you know, you get immersed for years, and then you know, some of these rules become second nature, and you start to think in those ways. But if it's completely new to you, you'll just gloss over. And I see that with policymakers. I gave 7 presentations to the legislative interim committees in 2021. 3 to the Water Committee, 2 to the Land Grant, and 1 to the Rural Economic Opportunity Task Force. And it has to be, you know, there's no way to get across water law in a 10 or 15-minute presentation. And so, you know, I have been impressed with the documents that have been put together by the Utton Center. In past years, you know, the Water Matters, they used to put together Water Matters publication. And when people ask me if they, you know, where they could get a quick primer, I always refer them to the Utton Center website. And, you know, it would be really worthwhile, I think, to do a conference. And I know there's some legislators that are so sincerely interested and want to learn. You know, I could name them 10 off the top of my head right now, who I bet would go to a conference where there was a primer and where you could talk about, the ancient, history of water with the First Peoples and indigenous communities here, and the long centuries of legacy of acequias, and then the American territorial period, and now all of that's so important to get that context. But so much has happened in water policy in the last 20 years, and there's a need to constantly be writing that history as we go, and they need the historical primer, the legal context, and then they're like, these are the current issues that are happening right now that are shaping water, water management, water policy as we speak, and that has to, I would say that could be a conference that different groups could collaborate on, and I think if they saw that there was a cross section of groups, they would trust that we weren't just pushing too one-sided of an agenda and just saying this is really about governing and managing our water for the future in a good way. So I would hope that if there's a way we could follow up on that conversation, I would be very open to that.
Thank you.
Okay, well, sorry to cut the questions off, but I think we do need to move on. So the folks who still have questions, please do put them in the chat, address them to everybody.